Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week we talked to John James Kirkwood, another one of our listeners who was willing to tell his own unique story of leaving fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, just like so many of the rest of us, but he did so as a pastor of a church, navigating his way through growing uncertainty and accumulating doubts about his faith, while at the same time leading a congregation of people who appeared to be quite happy in their own fundamentalist evangelical Christian faith. This week we're going to hear from another one who went through a comparable dilemma. This guest also walked that path that we're also familiar with, encountered the same questions and tripping over the same hazards, while also dealing with the anxiety of what family and friends think. But while we do that quietly and internally, privately, he also, just like John from last week did, he had to do this while leading groups of people who themselves were trying to strengthen their evangelical Christian faith. Not as a pastor like John last week, but as a professor of theology at an Evangelical Theological Seminary. And while the rest of us might worry about losing friends and family, we usually don't have to worry about losing our job. Our guest today had exactly that to lose, as well as his intellectual reputation and notoriety. This had to bring a whole other level of anxiety, confusion, and internal conflict. Don't you think, Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was myself studying for the ministry and so on, that it became quite clear to me that it's very different to have your beliefs connected to your vocation in life than otherwise, than just for them to just be beliefs,
Right.
Because just having beliefs and changing those beliefs has consequences, but doesn't have the practical consequence of maybe not being able to earn a living,
Yeah.
and also of having spent years of training and study and so on, and to have that all kind of maybe be for naught. So the stakes are much higher in those situations, which is why I imagine that a lot of profs and so on kind of just quietly go along.
Right.
But I really have high respect for the ones who feel they can't do that and are brave enough to take the kind of steps our next guest has had to take.
Right. And Scott, I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, this comes from a few years back when you were leading some kind of a small group. It was almost like a little church. And at the same time, you yourself are going through a lot of this deconstruction yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that must be really difficult.
Yeah, it was. But we're not talking about me today. We're talking about our guest. I've long been a fan of Dr. Peter Enns, and he's a very popular podcaster. My wife in particular really enjoys the Bible for Normal People, which is a great title.
The only God-ordained podcast on the internet.
Yeah, that's right. And he's written some really important books, The Evolution of Adam being among them, what the Bible does and doesn't say about human origins, which is an excellent book that I read a few years ago. And he's taught courses at Princeton Theological Seminary, Harvard, Fuller, Eastern, all the top American institutions of theological study. And he's currently the Abram S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies at Eastern University.
And probably the cherry on the top of the cake, we had him as our guest back in 2021.
Yes, that's right. So I'm really happy that we're having him again.
Now, before we play our recorded conversation with Pete, I'd like to explain why I wanted to reach out to him in particular about this episode. I wanted to talk to some academic, some credentialed theologian who had walked the same path of deconstruction and reconstruction that we've all been on, and I knew that Pete grew up in a very evangelical environment, even fundamentalist in some ways, as a kid, but that he'd made a whole career out of teaching that the Bible was not lowered down from heaven, that it's got human fingerprints all over it, and he frequently unpacks entirely new ways to understand passages in the Bible. I mean, stories like the creation and flood narratives in Genesis, or the conquest of Canaan stories, or even whole books of the Bible. Scott, you would know he often has episodes with titles like Pete Ruins Genesis, or Pete Ruins Nehemiah, Pete Ruins Christmas. And I can only assume that this very non-fundamentalist view of the Bible is a product of his walking the slippery slope. And I wanted to get his perspective on what Dr. Roger Olson, our guest a couple months back in January, what he had said about liberal Christianity being unorthodox and even heretical. So that's one reason, just that Peter is a credentialed theologian. But there's a second reason that I wanted to talk to Pete in particular. a more important reason. In fact, this is why I thought to first try to get Pete before I tried reaching out to any other theologian, progressive theologians, for this. It was something Pete said in his own podcast back in late November, right when I was wrestling with my own slippery slope issues and quite unsettled by that article I had read from Dr. Roger Olson. Pete was sharing with his co-host, Jared Bias, about the psychological and emotional impact that he experienced when he came to grips with losing his whole Christian worldview. And because of the emotional state I myself was in at that time, Pete's comment stopped me dead in my tracks. I was working in the backyard, and I just stopped, and I stood there for a couple of minutes, just pondering what he had said. And if I wasn't more of an emotionally stunted, boomer-age stoic who had learned that grown men never wear their emotions on their sleeve, in fact, an ex-Pentecostal who had developed antibodies against such outbursts of emotionalism, I won't deny that Pete's statement almost brought tears to my eyes. Seriously. I'll play an excerpt from that brutally vulnerable statement that Pete made later in this podcast, but first let's talk to Dr. Enns. But before I hit play, is there anything more you want to say here, Scott?
No, let's go.
Okay, here's our conversation with him just a few days ago.
Credentials,
you're a great guy. Pete, welcome once again to our podcast.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I think my wife has been looking forward to this as much as I have. She's a big fan, and she's read some of the books, and in particular, she's been following that whole SBC thing. And I believe you had a series on that. That really deeply affected her.
Yeah, that was pretty profound stuff. It affected me too. I'm
sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Okay. So, Pete, you're a world authority on the Old Testament, and God knows we have so many questions, Scott and I, on that topic. But as much as we'd love to tap into that, we've brought you in to tell us about you, about your journey, about Dr. Pete Enns, the theological seminary professor, walking that infamous slippery slope of faith deconstruction, reshaping your own worldview and spirituality into something more progressive. But here's the thing. Even as you're teaching year after year in that Evangelical Theological Seminary, all those cohorts of students who themselves are quite comfortable in their own personal evangelical bubbles and looking to you to strengthen and deepen that evangelical, sometimes fundamentalist Christian worldview. That has to add a whole other level of tension to the storyline. And I don't think many people know enough about your story. So, Pete, are you okay with sharing that with us?
Sure, yeah. How many hours do we have to talk about all this stuff?
You agreed to 18, so...
Okay. Yeah. Oh, good. This is the first 3 hours. And that's
okay.
Good,
So.
Okay, so let's start with a thumbnail sketch of where you came from, the family and the church family that you grew up in, you were born into, and that formed you spiritually before you came into your teen years and began to start thinking for yourself.
Right. Well, my parents were immigrants after the Second World War, and there's a long story there. My father was raised as a German Mennonite in Russia, and my mother as a German Lutheran in Poland. So it's all over the place, which, very typical. Just, there are Germans in Russia, there are Germans in Poland, right? And so they came to America. I was born here in 1961, and my sister and I, we were raised with just sort of a knowledge that God exists and of Jesus and things like that, but it wasn't in an evangelical sense. Having morning devotions and things what is that? Never heard of it. And, I joke with my students, I say, it's sort of like I was raised in a Christian home, just don't let it get out of hand. It's European, And so I'm glad for that, because I was raised with a belief in God. I mean, I believed in God. I had a conversion experience at a Nazarene church when I was 15. And that changed some things for me, not always for the better, I have to say, but so, yeah, that's where I came from. And I don't have some of the same struggles that other people have had who grew up a certain way, who went to youth group. I never went to youth group in my life. I didn't even know what it's
really?
like. Yeah, never did that. And part of me is like, yeah, I'm sort of glad for that. And another part of me is really glad for that, because I've talked to many people where that's where the struggles sort of mounted. Even my own children who went to youth group, they would come back now in their adult years and say, there's some good people there, but some of the stuff they were telling us, it was unintentionally manipulative. I'm not saying all Sunday schools, all youth groups do that, but so, that's basically where I'm coming from. And then as a teenager, Right.
So let's talk about that then. When you start becoming an independent thinker, you go to college, you develop your own worldview and your spirituality, and you start looking for a career path, your niche in the world. What got you thinking that ancient civilizations and dead languages was your ticket to fame and fortune?
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's sort of a funny thing because people who knew me never would have guessed in a million years that I'd be reading books and let alone writing books and teaching at a college level. They would have thought you're crazy for saying that, but I was always a good student, but I wasn't motivated. But what basically happened was after college, I went to a Christian college and I had a wonderful time. I learned things. I had friends.
Messiah College.
Messiah College, right now university, which is a school that must not be named because I teach at our rival school, Eastern University now. So we can't, we have to delete all that stuff. Now,
Okay.
just kidding. But yeah, so after Messiah College, I basically had like an epiphany when I was hanging out with a couple of friends of all places at our high school for the annual Thanksgiving Day football game against the rivals. And we just went there, we're done with college, hang out. And the other two guys got into this really interesting theological debate. One, my friend was something of a fundamentalist Christian, and the other was an atheist, a philosophy major in college. And they started talking about stuff. And I remember just sitting there thinking to myself, I can't really follow what they're saying, but it sounds important. And that was actually a big turning point in my life, because that's when I said to myself, if I'm going to believe stuff, I want to understand what I'm believing and why I believe it. And that started everything for me. It was another 3 years before I started seminary, but I read constantly for 3 years. Anything I could get my hands on that was relevant, whether church history of philosophy, biblical interpretation, and pretty good stuff, basic stuff just for understanding. And then I realized it was complicated, and it didn't bother me. I sort of liked the idea that there were smart people out there who knew more than I do about the Bible.
So that's where you got your MDiv, and then you did your master's and PhD at Harvard. Again, civilizations and dead languages. What spurred that?
Right. Well, I mean, just a slight correction. My BA is from Messiah College in behavioral science. Then my MDiv is from Westminster Theological Seminary, which I spent 4 years there. That's in suburban Philadelphia. And then, here's the thing. I went to seminary thinking, I don't know, I might want to be a pastor, but actually I just want to read stuff and learn, right? So about halfway through, I was there for 4 years, about halfway through, I decided I really want to go to graduate school. And I had started off actually thinking maybe it's going to be like theology, and then it went to church history. And I wound up getting into Old Testament studies because one of my professors, Tremper Longman, who's still a friend of mine after all these years, he said, Pete, you might want to get into Old Testament studies rather than New Testament because it's like 5 times the size and there's a lot more interesting stuff to talk about in terms of problems, which is not entirely true. The New Testament has its own issues.
Oh, yeah.
Very important ones. But and also I had another professor, Ray Dillard, who really pushed us to ask ourselves the question, what do you do with the Old Testament as a Christian? Which, the longer I studied, the more I realized that is the fundamental question of even the origins of Christianity. How does the Jesus movement connect with the Jewish tradition up to that point? And not always easily, sometimes with a lot of tension, I think. So that's what drove me to graduate school, and I applied to a few places. I was, thankful I was able to get into a good school, Harvard University, and I was there for 5 years. And I learned a lot. I learned that there are better explanations for certain things than I had been taught, and I didn't have any animosity about that. I just realized, it's more complicated than they told me in seminary, and I think there are better ways of looking at it. And primarily having Jewish professors, observant Jewish professors, James Kugel, John Levinson, to name 2 of them, that exposed me to a whole different world of what it means to read the Bible and how to interpret it. And that's when I got into the history of interpretation, Second Temple Judaism, right? That's going back to, a couple hundred years or so before the time of Christ. And then reading the New Testament and realizing this is a Jewish book. This is very Jewish. Paul was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Go figure. They weren't Catholic or Lutheran or something. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness gracious, the tumblers start falling into place in terms of asking the big question, and that I'm still answering in my own mind, what is the Bible? What is this thing that we talk about? How does it work? How do we read it well? And those are questions that have motivated me ever since.
And so these revelations you're getting at Harvard, which you're just talking about, would those be more, were they enriching your faith or challenging your faith?
Both. Seriously, I'm not trying to be coy here. I think they were enriching my faith because they were challenging it. And again, I think it takes a certain kind of temperament for that. I mean, that's not everyone would have that reaction, and I wouldn't think they're stupid or something for not having the same reaction I did, because people are wired differently, and that's fine. One quick story. Early on in my time there, my first semester, it was no later than early October. So the semester's not even half over at that point. And I came home from on my bicycle, and I parked in the back. I went into my kitchen, and I just stood there and I stared at the refrigerator. And I said, I'm not sure if Abraham was a real person.
Mm.
And I couldn't let anybody else hear me say that.
Yeah.
But it all made so much sense to me to put the pieces together in a certain way that, these are stories probably written during the monarchy. Not that they don't have old traditions behind them, but they're actually not concerned about detailing the life of some patriarch in the middle of the second millennium. They're actually interested in the monarchy. They're interested in Israel's story, and then these older stories are retold to fit into that later story, which is when the Bible was basically written, the monarchic and the post-monarchic periods. And you have these moments where it's just, my goodness, that makes so much sense. And it's a little bit scary, but in a good way for me. It was that feeling like I'm a little bit scared here, but boy, do I know this is the right way to go forward. So you just find your way.
Okay, so you just answered the question I was about to ask you. I said, was this enriching or challenging your faith? But I realized challenging can mean two different things as well. Challenging to be bigger and better, or challenging to give up. Mm-hmm. And were these seeds of doubt beginning to cause you to give up or to find a bigger and better faith?
Well, I can say that that's not stuff that made me want to give up.
Okay.
And I think in part because I didn't have the baggage coming into it. And I say that gently because that's not a nice way to describe people's lives. Up to that point, you've got garbage to deal with, or baggage.
Yeah.
But I think we do have things that weigh us down. And I didn't have in my upbringing these obstacles like, don't hang out with those liberals, those people, they'll change you and you'll go to hell when you die. I never once heard that growing up in church, even. I never, ever heard that stuff. Right. And I did sort of get some advice, when I left Westminster to go to Harvard, saying like, just keep your nose clean denominationally. Don't. And thankfully, my professors didn't say, none of my professors said this to me. They said, learn, explore. Right. And I did. But, don't make waves because, don't change. In other words, get the degree, but don't change what you believe. And that lasted about a week. And then seriously, by the middle of the first semester, and then by the end of the first year, I had a much bigger paradigm, a much bigger model for the whole field. And I realized, I understood that all that stuff we were told to shun and to be afraid of or to argue against apologetically, there's a reason people think that way about a lot of these hot button issues. And it's because they take into account more data. I think that's a simple way of putting it. They take into account more things that you have to take into account, and try not to explain too much away.
It's interesting, my experience in going to a conservative seminary, but I was an undergrad, but most of the Old Testament teaching that I encountered was apologetic against liberal Old Testament. It was why Wellhausen is wrong, and not so much about a positive trying to understand, but more why the conservative view is correct. So that's interesting. So were there any key thinkers or interpreters, theologians that had a significant impact on you in that journey?
I don't think specifically, more just how they were filtered through professors. But, it is people like Julius Wellhausen, who nobody's Wellhausian today, and they haven't been for a
No.
very long time. But any academic who studies the Bible will say something like the following: Torah emerged developmentally in stages, and somebody brought them together. And now, whether you think there are specific documents called P and J or E or D that you can point to, that's a debated point. But the notion that it was written and edited over a tremendous period of time, that's not a remotely controversial thing to say. And there are reasons for saying that. And that kind of stuff just got me excited. It did, because for one reason and one reason only, not because, as some people accuse me, it's just sexy, or just, tickling itching ears, and whatever is great and sexy, just go for it. No, it helped me understand. That's why I went to graduate school. I wanted to understand why the Bible looks the way that it does. And I was getting some answers too.
Okay.
Right.
So that's you at Harvard, but then you went back to Westminster Theological Seminary as a professor this time to teach Old Testament and biblical hermeneutics.
Right.
And if Scott and I were filmmakers creating your biography or a documentary of your life story, this would be the point in the film where we insert some kind of ominous music building in the background. Because you come back to Westminster Theological Seminary, you would have had to have signed off on their statements of belief. And one of those statements, I checked them out, the second one, in fact, says that Scripture as the very word of God written is absolutely authoritative and without error. Mm-hmm. And you must have, I'm assuming, you must have been doing some hesitating every year when you had to sign off on that.
Well, what I did actually was what I think my professors when I was there actually modeled for me. To say inerrant doesn't mean you know how it all works, right? So what I did is I came back to Westminster very consciously and with very positive attitude of bringing that particular Calvinist model of the Bible, which is generally much more sophisticated than your average evangelical or fundamentalist model, even though there's some fundamentalism in there. They're aware of history. They're aware of all these things that affect how we think about the Bible. But I began to try to synthesize what I had learned and what made so much sense to me and bring that into a conversation with a view of Scripture that is not traditionally amenable to these kinds of discussions. So in other words, what I did, and not super consciously, it just sort of happened. And again, others were doing this as well, that the inerrancy of the Bible means simply this: that whatever is there and however it works, God's okay with it. And I still feel that way. I just wouldn't call it an inerrantist model. I think you've left inerrancy at that point in time. But, I taught there for 14 years, and I would say with some success with the students. And I think many appreciate it. Some didn't appreciate it that much, but there was no hostility. They just didn't like it. But by and large, I think it went fairly well until more towards the end, when there were changes in administration and sort of the composition of the faculty that wanted to go back to basically the good old days of fighting liberals. And I had no interest in doing that. In fact, while I was there, I was twice asked to teach courses at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is supposedly our arch enemy. But I was sort of proud of that, because no one in my tradition had ever been asked to go there and teach anything. And so I did it for that reason. And because I wanted to build bridges, I wanted to be a part of a movement that would transform that more conservative Calvinist fundamentalist view to being much more open to engaging these points of view that traditionally they've been fighting against. And I think the seeds were there for doing that because of the composition of the faculty. But as that shifted over time, and as it shifted, I found myself not really moving so much myself, but everything else moving around me, moving the goalpost kind of thing. So, and it gets complicated because those who had a different point of view on what the Bible and biblical scholarship and biblical professors should be doing, they were articulating a particular narrative of that institution. That is true. That's how the institution was founded in 1929. But since then, there have been movements and developments. Well, some of us were accenting that side of the narrative. right? So it was really a clash of who gets to tell the narrative of the institution. That's really what it came down to. And even though this is the most indelicate thing I'll say, even though my side had the numbers, the other side had the political tacticians who knew how to get things done on a board level. And that's when things got to be a little bit unfortunate there. But
right.
Okay.
We're going to come to two periods in your life, and that's one of them, the confrontation with the board, and we'll get to a second one later on. But so far, I'm not hearing the term slippery slope. I was under the impression that you would have been, having come through Harvard and now going back to Westminster, I would have thought that there would have been a lot of tension internally over the beliefs you no longer have, that were changing, that you were losing. Is there not a slippery slope there? Were you struggling with anything in your belief system?
Well, I didn't really think of it as a slippery slope. And I would tell my students, at Westminster, everybody's on a slope. Everybody is. The most conservative person is on a slope of conservatism. You can get too conservative. You can go down that slippery slope and be sort of drunk on the power of conservative thinking. And then all of a sudden you come crashing down at the bottom in a pile of rocks. So everyone is on a slippery slope of some sort. The question is simply, how do we make sense of the Bible,
right,
taking its historical particularity seriously, not just theologically being 30,000 feet up above the air, looking down on the high points? How do you deal with the nitty gritty? And if you have a doctrine of Scripture that can't deal with that, it's not worth anything, as far as I'm concerned. And I mean this, I was genuinely willing to have that conversation within an inerrantist framework somehow, as long as nobody defined inerrancy for me. But as time went on, that became much more difficult because there was a lot of hostilities from colleagues who had didn't understand that's not their world. My world is not their world. And they judged me on the basis of their own theological standards that, in my opinion, was exactly the problem. For example, just if I can, in one faculty meeting, when I was coming under fire, this is within a year or so before I left, we were talking about Genesis chapter 1, right? The topic that keeps on giving, just what do you do with Genesis? Right? Genesis chapter 1. And I asked one of my colleagues, who was not a biblical scholar in any sense, he was more of a theologian, philosopher, apologist. I said, okay, listen, how do you handle the similarities between Genesis 1 and other creation myths of the ancient world, like the Enuma Elish, one of the Babylonian creation stories? And he said point blank, he says, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. My only job is to judge whether you're orthodox.
Oh.
At that point, I said, this conversation's over because I can't talk to this person, But saying this in a faculty meeting, and to me, that was really the divide of the institution, is those kinds of mindsets. And there was a whole bunch of faculty in the middle who had sympathy for the need to be curious and to explore, but were probably also a little bit nervous about how they might come under fire in a circumstance like that, And at that point, it was too late for me to salvage anything. And in fact, the president at one point told me to recant, and I said, I'm not going to do that. You're hurting people's faith. No, I'm not. I'm actually helping people's faith by giving them a Bible that they don't have to be embarrassed about and all that. So the last 3 years were a little bit testy.
Okay, so I do, as I said, we're going to come back to this confrontation with the board in one more minute. I have one quick question that I just want to finish off then. So I was referring to the slippery slope, and there's all kinds of elements that play into being on that slippery slope that Scott and I can relate to. I think you can too. One of those elements is the disorientation, where you think, okay, I used to believe this, but now I don't, and I used to think this, and I don't, and I throw away this and throw away that, so all the disorientation. But the other element that I want to ask you about here is the element of peer pressure. A lot of us, a lot of our listeners, they'll be thinking about, as they go through this giving up stage of their faith system, they'll be thinking, what will my parents think? Or they might think, what does my girlfriend think? But they're not often thinking, what will my boss think, or my career colleagues? And that's the thing you did. Your peer group includes scholars, professors, theologians, intellectuals, And not only would you be wondering what their thoughts were on this new worldview you were developing, but also I'm wondering if you might have been thinking, what will my students think? The ones who come to my classes and expect you to teach them a good orthodox evangelical theology. So what is that peer pressure like?
Well, oddly enough, I didn't feel the pressure from the students because I was a pretty popular professor. And, there are always grumblings in a school like that, but nothing that was derailing of anything. So I didn't feel that pressure from them. But, there's a saying, people will believe anything if their paycheck doesn't depend on it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the problem is, the reason I think I lasted as long as I did, which was 14 years, is because I pushed down certain issues, right? It wasn't a slippery slope. It was more, I was dying to just be myself, to be authentic. And I didn't realize what I was doing. And I remember I was there for 14 years. I haven't told this story to many people, but within about 2 to 3 years, deep inside of me, I could sense something that there's not a fit here. And I didn't even put it into words, really. I could sort of sense it. And years later, I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be a therapist. And he said to me, well, why didn't you leave when you sensed that? And I thought about it and I said, well, I went to school there and I came back to teach there. It's like going back home to be with your family. These are my people. This is my tribe. This is where I have an identity, right? And also, you got 3 kids, you got a mortgage, you got, ballet lessons or violin lessons or soccer camps, stuff. And he said to me, you sound like, and I said, no, why don't you tell me what I sound like? He said, you sound like a battered wife who doesn't leave. Where will I go? What will I do? And as soon as he said that, I said, that's exactly what I've been doing. I've been subjecting myself to not a beating, not abuse in any sense of the word, but I was subjecting myself to a situation where I could not be authentic. And nothing means more to me than being authentic in all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So that's more the pressures that I felt there than what will people say about me. Mm-hmm. But that's never been, if I'm going where I'm going with integrity and honesty with myself, I don't care what people say.
Okay.
I don't have that peer pressure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I've mentioned before on the podcast that I really think that's why Paul built tents, right? Yeah, right. Because he actually says that in one of his, he said, I didn't take anything from you. Yeah. I have, he had the freedom to be critical and not have to worry about, I guess, his livelihood.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't mean I'm right about everything when I say authentic, no. Right? I'm just saying okay, Pete, how does this work in the Bible? Well, here's how I think it works. And here are the reasons why I have it. To me, that's just being a thoughtful person, and if you're in a place where that can't happen, you need to leave.
Right.
And I thought that for a while, I thought that I could foster a different kind of conversation, which to a large extent, I was able to do that, as were others, and not just me. But when there was an administrative turnover, and then a board turnover, that's what changed everything.
Okay.
So let's talk about this confrontation with the board at Westminster. And there's a few facts I want to get on the table. One of which is, it seems to me, my reading of the story is that it revolves around one book in particular, one book that you wrote, Inspiration, Incarnation, Evangelicals, and the Problem of the Old Testament. So if I'm correct on that, let's talk just very briefly on what is that book about, what led you to write it, and what got the board so uptight about it?
What the book is about, how the Old Testament is really a deeply humanly, culturally embedded text. And how can we talk about a Bible like that given our theological parameters, right? One of which is inerrancy. And I used a very old analogy between Christ as both divine and human, which is inexplicable and a mystery of the faith, and saying the Bible works on analogy. Is it inspired? Sure. But it's also thoroughly human. And so if Genesis 1 describes creation the way that it does, I don't think that's how the universe began, but I don't think it's wrong, right? Because it is something that's being said by people at a particular time and place. And so I use that analogy for talking about what is the Bible? What should we expect from this text? And I think what the case was made, I'm going to say, I don't think with a lot of integrity. I think it was more of a pretext, but the case was made that this is a violation of the Westminster standards, the Confession of Faith and the catechisms, because they just didn't talk that way in the 17th century. And of course, my response is, well, of course they didn't talk this way in the 17th century. Are you suggesting that this is the standard for all of time for understanding anything? And I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, I said, have changed tremendously how we look at things like the gospel or Paul, the theology of the New Testament. And one professor said to me, I don't think it's changed anything. I said, well, then you don't know what you're talking about, because it has changed a lot. That's the truth. And that's not being snarky or snide. It's actually that kind of an attitude needs to be addressed very quickly. He happened to be a senior member of the faculty, but it didn't matter to me because that was such a profoundly difficult thing for me to understand. So I wanted to have that conversation with the tradition. And others were trying to defend a particular version of that tradition. And that's sort of how it happened. And so the board said, yeah, enough of this. And a majority of the faculty were voting for me, and the board voted after a lot of lobbying, I have to say, on the part of powerful people at the institution. But it was still fairly close. And I think 11 board members resigned after that, saying, we don't want anything to do with this place anymore. So.
Okay, so let's talk then about this confrontation with the board, the details of the investigation and how the proceedings played out. And this is more for the audience sake. I know you know this, Pete. But I want to get the facts on the table for them so that we can talk about orthodoxy and the control of orthodoxy. So there were a couple committees who looked into this book that you just described to us. They investigated this for 2 years and then submitted their findings to the seminary. Mm-hmm. And then the faculty voted on that report in December of 2007. The question being asked in this vote was whether the content of the book was within the bounds of your faculty oath. That oath being to things like the Westminster Confession of Faith and such creedal statements.
Right.
The outcome of that vote was decisive in your favor, 12 to 8. A substantial majority of faculty at Westminster saying the book did not violate your oath to the institution. But 3 months later, in March of 2008, the board members of the institution held their own vote. And their vote was also decisive, 18 to 9, but in the other direction, in favor of suspending your employment.
Right.
And after that vote, 9 trustees of the board resigned, and half a year later, you too officially resigned your teaching position. But 10 years later, in summer of 2015, sales of that book that we're talking about, Inspiration and Incarnation, sales were still so strong that Baker Books released a new updated edition, the 10th anniversary edition of this book, which now included an essay on the reception and the continued impact of the book. So those are the facts of the story. What I want to do now then is compare the perception of your book in the minds of the faculty versus the board versus the book publisher and the public who are buying the book, even your own perception, and how it relates to the battle over orthodoxy and controlling orthodoxy.
You mean in terms of now or in terms of back then?
Let's say now, because I'm including the publishers 10 years later saying this was such a great book. So much sales that we're going to do a new edition, revised edition. So go ahead.
Which I've always appreciated that too. Well, it's I have explained to people since I left Westminster over the years what happened, what exactly was the issue around this book, Inspiration and Incarnation, and people can't understand why in the world this would be a problem for anybody. What I'm saying is the Bible is a human book. No one would disagree with that. No conservative would disagree with the Bible being human. It's inspired, but it's also human. But that has implications if we mean that. Just like Jesus' humanity, he dies. He gets cut. He bleeds. He forgets things. Did he have to learn how to be a carpenter or a mason or whatever he was? Of course he did. He grew in wisdom. This is just, it's part of being human, and Jesus was fully human. So I understand, but on the same sense, it's baffling to me how there can be serious educational institutions who have difficulty with, as I said before, the historical particularity of Scripture that everyone studies, including evangelicals. But there are just certain answers you're supposed to come up with when you do that, right? There are predetermined conclusions for some of that. So that, I have to say, that's a big thing, Luke, for me. I'm more baffled as time goes on. I'm not obsessing over it. I just say it's like that was weird. That was really, really, really weird, and to use Jesus as a model for thinking about the Bible, that's old as well. I didn't make that up. But, people by and large appreciate the book. I think people were and still are probably, they're warned of it, like, don't let it affect you. It was sort of funny, in at least one presbytery that I'm aware of, they used my book as a litmus test. What do you think of Enns in this book? And there is a right answer to that question. But again, that's the small part of it. The bigger part of it is, I think a lot of people have been able to breathe a breath of fresh air about the Bible, saying, I don't have to defend weird stuff. This is, I don't think God gives orders to kill people and take their land. I believe that the Old Testament writers, some of them, not all, some of them did think that way. And of course they would. Why wouldn't they? They're living in the Iron Age. This is how you talk about your gods as warriors, right? So now with that, how do we think theologically about the Bible? That's sort of like the book.
What about the comeback from conservatives that, okay, the Bible is, Jesus' incarnation, he's fully human, fully God, but he's sinless. Mm-hmm. So the Bible, yes, is incarnational, but it still must be without error. If it, that kind of.
Well, that's the problem. There is the equating of sin with error. That's I think where the analogy breaks down, because they use that argument to say, again, the Adam and Eve story has to be taken literally.
Right.
But if I say it's mythical, which I do believe it's mythical, that's my opinion. You can disagree. I think it's mythical. That doesn't mean it's an error.
Right.
The mythic nature is part of the human contextuality. And that, to me, that's no different than Jesus having olive skin, wearing sandals, speaking Aramaic.
Right.
Those things are not errors either. They're just part of the humanity of it all. And where the sin falls into it, did Jesus ever do something? Did Jesus ever sin? That's an interesting question. Maybe not in the big ways, but did he ever talk back to his mother? In other words, was he ever a normal teenager? Did he ever just usurp his independence and authority? And of course, those are speculative questions, but
it would make him somewhat less than human if he didn't argue back with his parent, in a sense, right?
That's just it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And people have said, even with respect to my book, that the reason it wasn't received well in certain areas, certain theological communities, is because they haven't really grappled with the humanity of Christ. And I think there's some truth to that, and it's rather obvious grappling. I think that has to be done. It's not deep thinking. It's just, if he's human, there are implications of that.
Right.
I ask my students, what makes Jesus divine? And they say his resurrection. I said, gods aren't raised from the dead. People are. What else? Well, miracles. People do miracles all over the place in the Bible. What makes Jesus God? And it's hard to come up with stuff. And they say, well, forgiving sins. But even that is somewhat controversial, that exactly what that means in the Gospels. But we're dealing with a mystery. So I was using the mystery of the incarnation as an analogy for understanding the mystery of Scripture.
So when I read the story of your confrontation with the board at Westminster, it just sounded like it was a control over orthodoxy. And so that's what I want to talk about very briefly. We did an interview, I think 2 months ago now, with Roger Olson. I don't know if you know Roger, but
sure, of course,
he that was very much, our discussion with him was very much around orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was his essay that I read on how we liberal Christians are unorthodox. That's what actually motivated me to restart this next season of the podcast up. Mm. And so I see your story here is also, it's about orthodoxy. You've written many great books, and we've already talked about inspiration and incarnation, but you did do another book as well, The Sin of Certainty, Why God Desires Our Trust More Than Our Correct Beliefs. There's that word orthodoxy. Do you want to say anything about that word, the internal struggle that we might experience in our heads at night, or the external struggle that you had on a stage in academia and in stages over controlling orthodoxy?
Yeah, I think orthodoxy is in the eye of the beholder because different traditions are convinced that they're orthodox and others aren't because of things like, do you have an organ or a guitar in your worship service? I mean, it can be as ridiculous as that. And so, yeah, I think orthodoxy, there are core elements of the Christian faith. Let's call it dogma, right? That Christians have historically agreed on, even if they want to talk about what it means, but they agree on it. Like, atonement is pretty important. Jesus as not just being a human being is pretty important. Resurrection is pretty important. Speaking in tongues, that's peripheral. That's the next circle out. That's more like election. I mean, not everybody believes in election. Infant Baptist, right? All those things, those are dogmas. Those are doctrines of various iterations of Christianity. And then on the outside circle, you have basically opinions, like should you go to church twice a week? All those kinds of things, right? And a friend of mine, John Franke, is a theologian. He's a friend of mine, but he's put it this way. He says the problem with liberals, they put everything in the opinion category. And the problem with fundamentalists, they put everything in the dogma category. So that's just a joke. He doesn't really mean that, but it's
that's good though.
It reminds me though that it's like, this is like, you're not orthodox unless you believe certain things, but the things they expect you to believe in can sometimes run up against, frankly, the patterns and themes of Scripture itself. And I find that fascinating. The Bible, I think, resists that kind of orthodox framing and is more pointers pushing us in certain directions, right? So I'm not against orthodoxy. I just don't think people have it as much as they think they do. And what is orthodox is a valuable topic of very serious theological reflection and communication and discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so Pete, there was two parts of your life story that I want to talk about, one of which was that confrontation with the board, and we've covered that quite well. I also did want to come back to another part of your life story that pertains again to the slippery slope. This is one of the themes of this episode. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned earlier how there's a few elements to that slippery slope idea that everyone can relate to. One is the disillusionment. I used to believe this and this and this, and now I don't. What do I believe anymore? There's also the peer pressure. We talked about that. But there's another element. It's the emotional roller coaster that people feel when they get to the bottom of that slippery slope.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I heard you talk about in one of your episodes. It was in November or December. It was your interview with Hillary McBride and Preston McDaniel Hill. And you were talking to them about the emotional and psychological impact of leaving a long-held form of belief.
Yeah.
You said something that really struck a chord in me, partly because I was going through that was a very low point in my own long journey through faith. It was around Christmas time. I was at an especially low point, a lot of doubt and confusion and sadness. And then here's what you said to them that struck my heart.
It's similar for a lot of people. But for you, Pete, like, what were some of the psychological effects of leaving that faith tradition or that community or that expression at the time for you?
Well, I mean, it wasn't one thing. There was a little path. And at first, it was just an incredible sense of relief. I mean, I was in a different situation. It was employment, but still I felt like, goodness gracious, I'm out from under this oppressive way of thinking. But then I think the real stuff hit me months later when I realized there was nobody watching me anymore. There was no guardrail, so I felt really alone, and it was a very disorienting experience. And that's when things for me got very just silent. I mean, there was sadness. I remember lying on my sofa in what was my study at the time and just thinking to myself, I'll never sing another Christmas carol again. I won't have those familiar holiday rhythms because nothing made sense to me. So I think sadness, a little bit of fear about not having a narrative, a totalizing narrative, right, that makes sense of everything.
So, Pete, I've got to say, I almost cried when I heard you say you'll probably never sing another Christmas carol again. Do you mind telling us again about that emotional roller coaster that you experienced at the bottom of what looks to me like a slippery slope in your life?
Yeah, I think, slippery slope or more just a crash against a wall. But the idea, that's just my analogy. The issues are the same, I think, regardless of what we call it. But, very quickly, when I left Westminster, I was so happy. I didn't have people tell me what to think anymore. I had a severance that lasted a long time because I knew where the bodies were buried. It was not a bad situation. But within 6 months, I started feeling untethered and like really disoriented about what do I believe. And I had this moment about that time where I just was staring out the window and I said to myself, I don't know what I believe anymore, if anything. And then I felt something. I mean, I don't want to get mystical here, but a thought entered my head. It went something like this. Well, Pete, you got what you wanted. Now what are you going to do? Right. And that was very disorienting because I was reading a lot of stuff that thought about the world differently than I had been used to thinking about it. And it made sense to me. And it was difficult. It isn't like this was an easy thing for me to do. Fighting within a system is easy, but once you leave the system, and who are you? Like, what identity? That's why people don't want to leave churches for the same reason. And I get it, right? They don't want to upset their family systems because it's difficult, it's lonely, it's frightening. And it's like, where will I go? What will I do? So I understand that. I understand that very deeply. And so I remember during that time just wondering, am I ever going to believe anything again? I wasn't like an active atheist. I was just nothing. I didn't know. I'm so used to speaking in a certain way. I can't speak that way anymore. I remember lying on my couch in my basement office, no windows, which is, I don't recommend, by the way, when you're going through a crisis, having an office with no windows. And that's when I was laying there saying, I may never sing another Christmas carol again. I may never do any of these things I'm used to. And I got very sad. And I lamented where I was, but yet I couldn't deny I was in a very authentic place. And that was helpful for me. I had to go through that. But there's always something beyond that too. I think if you're honest with those feelings that we have, and feelings are a big part of the life of faith. We feel things, we feel fear, we feel joy, all those things. And one of the things that helped me move, because I was stuck, I was in inertia. And, if it's the slippery slope, I use the analogy in the Sin of Certainty of a mine shaft. It's like you're careening down into the deep darkness of like 100 miles an hour. And then you get to the bottom and it's literally pitch dark and you have to get out and start groping around and finding your way. That's what it was like for me. And the one story, this is a true story, that helped me involves Mother Teresa and a theologian from St. Louis University, John Kavanaugh. He was going through his own crisis of faith. So he went to visit Mother Teresa in what used to be called Calcutta. And she met him and he said, can you pray for me? She said, what do you want me to pray for? And he said, pray that I have clarity. And she laughed and she said, I will not pray for that. And he said, why the heck not? No, she didn't say that. She said, why not? And this is the thing she said, because clarity is the last thing you're clinging to and must let go of. Which he didn't like that answer at all, but that hit me. I was like, but then he kept going. He said, but you seem to have a lot of clarity. And she laughed again. She said, I've never had clarity a day in my life, but what I've had is trust. So I pray that you trust. And I looked away and I said to myself, literally, I've been doing this wrong. I've been looking for ways to hold on to that sense of certainty that I'm basically right about my theology. And this is like, no, you can't go. God's too big for that. God is too mysterious for that. In other words, there's a path through this period, and it is frightening. It almost has to be, because we're letting go of not of God, but of our own understanding of God. No one likes to let go of it. I don't like to let go of that, but I've learned to let go of that because as soon as I have a thought, I try to let go of it because what do I know, right? But we're used to being told you can't doubt at all. You have to have certainty in your faith. If you don't have certainty, God's mad at you. And when I say the sin of certainty as a title of the book, I'm not saying it's sinful to feel certain. I'm saying it's sinful to think that you have to hold on to that no matter what. And it's really sinful when you have religious leaders telling you, you cannot doubt. If you doubt, you're this close to going to hell when you die. And that to me is utterly, it's disrespecting the mystery of God. And I get sort of amped up about it.
Yeah, well, I rightly so. And in your country right now, that's a huge issue, isn't it? I mean, this whole Trumpian movement, it
There it
really
is.
hits that. Well, no, but
The word came in.
The word came in. It's like it's become the new Nazi. That in any conversation, Trump will come up.
Well, yeah,
but
it's. I think that's his plan, really, to come up in every conversation. But,
yeah, well, I think you're right. But
Yeah.
it's that certainty again, like the believers, and frankly on the far left too. It's that sin of certainty, right? Just
Yeah.
absolutely convinced, and everybody else is completely wrong, and there's no
Mhm.
ability to compromise, no ability to have a discussion.
No nuance, no anything.
nuance,
Yeah, absolutely
yeah.
right. I mean, it's both ends of the spectrum have a similar attachment to here it is, folks.
Yeah.
And if you disagree, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah.
All right,
It's very destructive.
whatever.
Okay, I want to put one more book on the table. You've written so many great books, and I think this is your latest book, Curveball. A nice short title. But then there's a subtitle, When Your Faith Takes Turns You Never Saw Coming, or How I Stumbled and Tripped My Way to Finding a Bigger God. Pete, you must get an earful from your editor over your subtitles.
No, this is what happens when the publisher and the author can't agree on the subtitle.
Yeah.
You put them both in.
You put them both in.
Theirs was the first one. Mine was the second one.
Okay.
So the title tells me, and I confess I haven't read this one, but the title tells me this is very relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, curveball basically is about life throws you curveballs. And the question is, you have to, like baseball, I'm a baseball guy. So if you have to adjust to what's pitched to you. And if you can't adjust, you're going to be sitting on the bench pretty soon. And so I think some of those curveballs for me have been thinking about science, for one thing, and I have a couple chapters on quantum physics, which I don't understand, but I understand the analogies that scientists use to talk about quantum physics, or evolution, or Einstein, or just the nature of the Bible. My own experiences being in a graduate school where no one thought like I did, and how do I manage that stuff, and thinking of raising children, or life after death. What happens to us when we die? No, really, what happens to us when we die, and how do we know? All those kinds of questions. So that's what Curveball is about. The curveballs that have led me to adjust my thinking about theology. When prayer doesn't help your kid's anxiety, but medicine does, that sounds sort of innocent, but it makes you think, like, are we just a mass of chemicals or something? What's happening here? Like, the prayer chain did nothing. Reading Psalms did nothing to an 8-year-old, all that kind of stuff. Like, so what helps? Well, doctors help, right? So what are we as people? And all these primary and secondary cause kinds of questions come up. But if we're paying attention to stuff that happens to us in life, will, not might, will affect your theology, because your theology is never settled because God is beyond comprehension.
Okay.
Excellent.
That's what it's about.
Okay, so we're getting short on time. I just had one more question then, just to, the application part that every sermon has, right? What do we do with this? I didn't know, Pete, if you had any advice to our listeners who are struggling personally with Christian faith and the Bible. Especially, we've got many people in our audience who are they're religious teachers, professors, and pastors who themselves are full of doubts, and yet at the same time they're teaching students or congregants who are so full of naive conviction. So any advice for them?
Right. Well, I think that is really the predicament. And yeah, I have doubts all the time. I've come to terms with the fact that is part of the fabric of faith. Do you believe X, Y, and Z? Yeah, most days, but some days I have real problems with it. And that's just being honest. So the way I do this myself in my classes is that my job is not to force my journey of faith onto anybody, let alone onto 18-year-olds who have probably never done their laundry before. And here they are in college and everything's unstable, but their faith, that's still there. Of course, at Eastern, we have a diverse population too. We have everywhere from people who don't really believe much at all to pretty conservative Christians and everything in the middle. So it's hard to know sometimes what to do. But basically, my job is to help them on the journey of faith that they are on, whether they know it or not. And so I try to both challenge students, but the same voice affirm them and where they are. And, like sometimes I realize, I'm not sure I like my church that much after thinking about it more. And I said, well, God's at your church too, right? It isn't like you have to run away from it. There's something good that happened to you. Haven't you liked it? Yeah, there's something good happening there. But at some point you have to make decisions in your life where you want to go to church. And in some cases, people stop going to church for a while, and for very good reason, I think. It's just sometimes church is toxic. So I want to remind them that their horizons, they haven't reached the horizon yet. They're nowhere near it. It's way out there. But in the meantime, you're on this journey of faith that God understands and respects and loves you, and you move at your own pace. And that gives me some capital to push them on issues, like did the flood happen? Well, here are reasons why people say it probably didn't, even though there was something that happened in some local flood stuff. And I get to say that because I tell them, here's where I'm at. Here's where my thinking is on this issue. And I understand some of you may be thinking differently about that. That's okay. You don't have to agree with what I'm saying, but I do want you to know how most academics think about this issue, right? And to me, that I can be honest at a place like Eastern University talking to my students like that. You can't do that everywhere. And that's part of the problem that some people face, whether they're pastors or teachers. You have to be really careful not to say anything other than what just stays on the beach blanket. It's like it's right there and it doesn't wander off. And I think for people, you come to a point in your life and you'll know when you get there, when you say to yourself, I'm not sure this is sustainable anymore. I think my heart is shrinking and shriveling, and I may have to think about what else to do. And I don't say that lightly, because we've invested a lot in our lives, in our institutions, in our churches. I've stayed in churches much longer than I probably should have because it was too hard to leave. But then when I did leave, it was like, yeah, that was absolutely the right thing to do.
Okay. So before we go then, is there anything that you would want to say that we didn't cover? Or if not, let us know what's coming down the pipeline. Any more Pete Enns books coming up?
Yeah, well, nothing really that I can think of we needed to talk about, but I'm kicking around ideas about a book. That's all I can say at this point, because that's what it is. I'm kicking around ideas about different, like the question, what is the Bible? Well, it's a lot of things, and it's different things to different people, and sort of a book around that theme is probably what I'm going to do next, but don't hold me to it.
Okay. Well, Pete, thank you so much. This really has been fun. Yeah. It's been informative. It's been relevant. Yeah. I'm so glad we were able to connect with you again. And I look forward to the next time again.
Yeah. Good to be here with you guys. Thanks a lot.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys. See ya.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.